everyone, welcome to the Eyes Open Network and today's Daily Eye Opener. The purpose of the Daily Eye Opener is simply to challenge you to take a look at something from a different perspective. When we're coming up with the videos for the Daily Eye Opener, they're designed around things that in our early stages of educating ourselves, we came across so many different factual pieces of information that we had never read before and didn't really know. And so the purpose is to try and create that same sort of perspective-changing concept for you to challenge you to see things in a little bit of a different light. Today's daily eye-opener is based on, the understanding the Federal Reserve a little bit better and how the coming economic collapse is directly impacted by the creation of the Federal Reserve back in 1913. Meetings started back in 1910, and not coincidentally, the IRS was created in 1913 as well. But just the entire concept of what the Federal Reserve represents was a very eye-opening experience, I know for me, and I know for some of my other colleagues it was as well. And so we're hoping that by creating this video that we can open your eyes to the possibility that the upcoming economic collapse has been in motion since 1913, over 100 years ago. So sometimes the things that happen in our world around us 100 years ago are significant enough that we need to pay attention. So without further ado, let's roll right into the understanding of the Federal Reserve and the coming economic collapse.
Money is created in an amazing way. Since there is no backing to money anymore, there used to be gold or silver behind money. In those days, money was created when there was a certain amount of gold or silver that was brought into the bank and put into the vault. Then the paper money was issued as more or less like a receipt. Say, we got your gold or your silver in the vault. Here's your receipt. It's got a little, looks like this, and it's got all kinds of decorations around the side. It says you got $10 or $20 worth of gold or silver. It's a receipt. That was how money was created, and then you could bring the receipt back at any time and get your gold or silver swapped back out. That's the beginning of the process. Well, it didn't stay that way very long in history because the bankers discovered that while they're sitting on all this gold and silver and the people are circulating these receipts, that very seldom did all of the receipts come back, or even very many of them. People were very content to let the gold and silver sit there and just use the receipts. So the temptation was so great that they began to issue more receipts than there was gold or silver. And that was the beginning of fractional reserve banking, as they call it, in which the money supply begins to expand. And it's artificially expanding because of a decision made by the bankers and later on by the politicians who went into partnership with the bankers that this was an acceptable practice. Of course, the danger with that is that if all of the, or even a substantial number of the depositors did want to take their receipts back to the bank and demand their gold or silver in return, there wouldn't be enough to keep the obligation. And so there'd be a run on the bank, and the banks would have to close their doors, and in some cases they'd actually go out of business. They'd be bankrupt, and people would lose their deposits. The bankers themselves very seldom lost very much. They might have gone to work for another bank or opened up a new bank down the street, but the depositors often lost a lot of money in this fashion, and that was the reason for going into partnership with the governments, because the governments would then say, well, the law says that the banks can do that legally. So there's no prosecution. You can't prosecute these bankers anymore because they didn't violate the law. Because of their partnership with the government, the law made it legal to do exactly what they are doing, which is one of the reasons that cartels like to go into partnership with the government.
Let's set up a game of Monopoly and you want to buy Park Place. What I can continually do is just print money, give myself more money, lower the value of your money by printing more. No matter how hardworking you are or how successful you are, I can always end up buying you for free.
The whole of this crazy society is based on money. Ironically, money that has never, does not, and will never exist. It's just figures on a screen. When you go into a bank, you say borrow $50,000. What does the bank do? It doesn't print any more money. It doesn't move any precious metal anywhere. It just types into your account $50,000, which it has pulled out of fresh air. And then you start paying the bank interest on the $50,000. So the whole money system is like, you know, in those cartoons where there's a chase going on and all the cartoon characters are chasing each other, and eventually they run over the edge of a cliff, and they don't realize they've run over the edge of the cliff, so they keep running straight ahead on fresh air. And then someone looks down, realizes they're on fresh air, and bang, down it comes.
Let me ask you this. If you or I create money, it's called counterfeiting. When the banks do it, it's called increasing the money supply. Most importantly, how did the banks get this power? This is Jekyll Island. Back in 1910, representatives from the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Morgans, and other private bankers met in secret to draft the legislation that would create the Federal Reserve. Edward Griffin wrote a book on what exactly happened on Jekyll Island.
Central banks are banking cartels which have gone into partnership with the respective governments in the countries where they operate. And they've been given monopolistic power over the creation of the nation's money supply. That's what the politicians handed to them as a gift, you might say, for the partnership. Now, in return, what did the bankers do for the politicians? They promised to create money out of nothing, now that they've got this legal power to do it anytime the government needs it.
What is the definition of a cartel? An association of manufacturers or suppliers with the purpose of maintaining prices at a high level and restricting competition.
The Federal Reserve is a strange creature. There's nothing quite like it out there. Most people think that it is a government agency and that it's here to protect the best interests of the common man. But the truth of the matter is, when you cut through all of the debate and all of the research, you come to the startling realization that the Federal Reserve System is a cartel. It's a cartel, no different really than a sugar cartel or an oil cartel or a bean cartel. Happens to be a banking cartel. And that means that it is private. It means that the big banks of the United States came together in 1913, and they convinced Congress to pass a law that we call the Federal Reserve Act. And this law became the embodiment of the cartel agreement. You see, what cartels do generally is they decide that they don't want to compete with each other. Cartels are made up of different separate companies which on the surface appear to be competitors. And they decide they don't want to compete with each other. They want to improve their profit margins and solidify their position in the marketplace. And so they want to get rid of competition, and they decide they're going to fix prices or divide up product or geography or something like that. And they come to cartel agreements to reduce competition between themselves. One of the problems with cartels is that it's very difficult to enforce those rules and regulations, those agreements. How do you do it? If a member of the cartel wishes to drop out and say, I don't want to play anymore, there's nothing that the other members can do, unless they have made that cartel agreement into law. Now, if they've taken the cartel agreement and they've passed it through the legislature of the nation, now it becomes law, and now when one of the members tries to drop out, they can call the government into play and use the police force of the nation to enforce the cartel agreement. Which is why all cartels love to have government involved as a partner. And that is exactly what happened in the banking industry in the United States back in 1913. The Federal Reserve Act is nothing more or less than the laws of the rules and the regulations, the cartel agreement of the banking fraternity. It's how they decided they would reduce or eliminate competition between themselves. and they brought the federal government into it, the Congress, to pass that in the form of law. So what we're dealing with here is not a government agency at all. Now, it has some of the trappings of political appearance because the president appoints the directors to the board of directors and so forth, the board of the Federal Reserve System. But the fact is, Congress or the president has no control whatsoever over what the Federal Reserve System does. It's completely independent. So the question arises, is this good or bad for the American people? We have a cartel which has been given the power to create the nation's money, incredible as that may sound, to create the nation's money, which is something that even Congress is not allowed to do based on debt. The Constitution of the United States says that Congress shall create money only when it's backed by coins, when it's backed by something like gold or silver, has intrinsic value. The Congress cannot create money based on debt, according to the Constitution, fiat money. Congress actually gave that power, which it did not have, to this cartel, the banking cartel, which we call the Federal Reserve System. It's an amazing power. And so the private banks of America have a monopolistic power to create the nation's money, and they create it out of nothing. There's no gold or silver backing behind it at all. And it's completely up to them as to how much they want to create, when they want to do it, and so forth. They can expand or contract the money supply. Now, supposedly they do this in the best interests of the American people. I mean, when the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board is called to testify before Congress, and he gives his little speech, he says, well, we had to raise interest rates today, or we had to lower interest rates today, whatever the case may be. He doesn't say we did this because it was in the best interests of our banks. He always says, well, we did this for you folks. We did this for the American people. We did this because we were concerned about the economy heating up, or we're concerned about the economy lagging behind. And we don't want people to be unemployed. We don't want inflation to be too high. It's always for the American people. But the truth is, it's a cartel. And all cartels act with the primary instinct of preserving their own best interests first. So is this in the best interest of the United States and of the American people? It is not, because that means that the money supply, which is the lifeblood of everything we do, is totally controlled by a relatively small group of people who we don't even know their names in most cases. And they are using this power to the benefit of the banking system, not to the benefit of the United States. Well, here's how it works. Remember, I said before that the Federal Reserve really is a partnership between government and the banks. So when you have a partnership, there has to be a reason, an advantage to both parties to become a partner. So to understand how this works, let's start with the government side of this partnership. The government needs money. Politicians need money. They need more and more and more money for whatever purpose. But they don't like to raise taxes. They need more money, but they want to lower taxes because that's politically expedient. If they raised the taxes to pay for all of the government projects, why, there'd be such an uproar among the taxpayers that these guys would be voted out of office at the next election. So they don't do that. They increase expenses, and they try and keep taxes low or lower than normal. How do they do that? Well, they borrow it. That's like anybody else would do. If you want to spend more than you take in, you can borrow. You can steal it, of course, which I think is another good analogy. But in this case, let's just stick with the part of borrowing it. So the government goes on record and says, we want to borrow money from the public. And so they offer these government bonds or certificates of some kind or another, treasury notes and bills, depending on their maturity dates. And they offer to pay back that money within a certain period of time, plus interest. So now they have this more money that they needed. The trouble with that, of course, is that after the period of time elapses, they've got to pay it back. Well, lo and behold, when it comes time to pay it back, the politicians are still spending more than they're taking in taxes, and so they don't have it to pay it back. Not to worry, they'll just borrow some more. So they go through a cycle. Well, this time we'll borrow enough to cover the old loans plus the interest and plus a little bit more to expand our government operations. And this goes around and around and around, and we have this thing called the rising national debt. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger because the politicians are never expecting to pay back those original debts. And in fact, they never will. And they know they never will. The money system will just fall apart before they ever have to face that problem, and that'll be, you know, their children and their grandchildren having to deal with that one. Well, no, so far so good. So they borrow this money, and the debt goes up and up and up. But there's so far there's no new money created because the money they have borrowed was money that was already in existence. Let's say that I wanted to buy a government bond, so I loan money to the government. No new money is created. They just got some of the original money back in the form of a loan. Where the new money comes into play is at a next step. You see, they never have enough. They never can borrow enough from the general population or from investment firms or from banks or from other countries. There's never enough money out there to borrow. They need more. And so this is where the Federal Reserve comes in. There's usually a margin, anywhere from 7 to 20 to 30% of what they need to borrow that just doesn't exist. Or in order for them to borrow it, they would have to raise the interest rates to attract that much more money in, and they don't want to raise the interest rates. So now they finally go to their partner, the Federal Reserve System. And they say, okay, partner, here's where you come into the game. We need to borrow today, let's just say another $1 billion. And the Federal Reserve officer says, okay, that's fine. Figuratively, he pulls out the desk drawer, pulls out this big black book, checkbook. Of course, this is all done by computers in reality, but for the sake of analogy here, it's a little easier to visualize with a checkbook. So he writes a check for $1 billion to the United States government and hands it to the Treasury official. He says, thank you very much. He goes down and deposits this $1 billion check into the government's checking account. Okay, so now they have another $1 billion loaned, supposedly. The question is, where did that money come from? What account did it come from? Who put the money into the Federal Reserve System for that $1 billion to be loaned? And the answer is, nobody did. There is no money. It just came out of thin air. It was manufactured just for the purpose of this loan. Now, if you and I were to do that, we'd go to jail. But the Federal Reserve can do it because the government wants them to do it, because they're the lender of last resort. It doesn't make any difference if they can borrow enough money from the private sector at the rates they want to offer. It doesn't make any difference because they know at the last minute they can always go to the Federal Reserve, and by obligation, the Federal Reserve will create that money out of thin air, just the way they used to do it on the printing presses. Except today they don't use printing presses for most of it because it's checkbook money. It's in a computer, it's digits, it's invisible. They just create it out of thin air. And now this is new money, and the money supply expands on the basis of what money was created for this loan. Now that's just the beginning of the cycle. That's really the smaller side of it. This is really peanuts compared to the next cycle that I'm going to describe. So far we've talked about why the government is in this partnership, and we can see that their primary motive is because they can have access to any amount of money that they might need at any time without any questions, at any rate of interest they choose to offer. Not a bad deal. But now let's see what happens to that money. Let's assume that the fellow who delivers the mail, the post office worker, gets a check from the post office for $1,000. And now that was newly created money through the process which I just described. It's newly created money, and the post office worker doesn't know that it didn't exist the day before anywhere in the universe. He doesn't care. It's spendable money now. So he takes this check to his private bank, commercial bank down the block, and deposits it into his private checking account. Now, finally, the money is out of the government side and goes into the private commercial banking side, and this is where the action really heats up. If I were the president of the local bank where this $1,000 had been deposited, I would have been able to stand up in front of the people there in the bank and say, attention everyone, this gentleman just deposited $1,000 into our venerable bank. And everybody would be happy because generally people go to the banks to borrow money. A lot of them do. And so they know that if there's money on deposit and there's lots of money to lend, generally that means that the rates of interest are low. So people are happy to know that we have money to lend. You might ask me, well, how much money do you have to loan? And I'd say, well, how much do you need? And you would say, well, I was looking at a used car, $9,000 would be about right. And I'd say, I can do that. But you would say, I thought he just deposited $1,000. I would say, yes, he did. And this could go back and forth, and you'd say, well, how can you loan $9,000 when he only deposited $1,000? And if I were a good banker, I would say, don't worry about it, sir. It's all quite legal. It's all regulated by the Federal Reserve System. It's entirely possible, and indeed it is, because according to the Federal Reserve regulations, which, don't forget, are created by the banks for the banks, all the banks have to have, at the current time, is 10% of their deposits in reserve compared to the amount of loans that they put out. 10% in reserve. So if you take $1,000 and you put that in your accounting ledger under the heading, and you put the word on the top that says reserve, now you've got $1,000 in reserve, and that's 10% of $10,000, which means you can loan $9,000 and still have 10% reserve. So now the banks can literally create $9,000 out of thin air and still be quite legal because they've got 10% in reserve. Now that's kind of an oversimplified way of explaining it, but basically that's the accounting that goes on. So the banks will be able to, I would, as a banker, would be able to create $9,000 out of nothing and loan it to you at interest. Now just think about that for a minute.
Wow, that was a great video. What does it all mean to you? Well, specifically what it means is that if you take a hard look at what I was talking about in the video, or what was brought to light in the video, is that the entire money system is headed for collapse. There's so much fake money that has been created, it can no longer sustain itself. If you look at the history of the world, there's no country that is using a fiat currency that has not seen the complete collapse of the money system because it's backed by nothing. All right. So what are some of the other highlights that we went through in the last video? Well, one of the things that was highlighted was the concept of the word cartel. And, what is a cartel? And let me tell you, the banking system, or the bankings who got together to form a partnership so they didn't have to compete against each other, eliminating competition, that's the essence of a cartel. Fix the market. We'll work together. We'll make sure. If you and I did that, it'd be collusion, and we'd all go to jail. So it's intriguing to go through that concept. One of the other great points that is important to remember: the U.S. Constitution states that Congress can only create money when it's backed by coin, something tangible, right? A precious metal, not due to debt, right? The Federal Reserve. Because, going back to the cartel thing, the idea was that they got together with the banks, the big banks got together, and in 1913 they convinced the Congress to pass a law called the Federal Reserve Act. And that act, the Federal Reserve Act, actually granted legal authority to the Federal Reserve System to create legal tender. It's crazy if you think about it. So part of when you're thinking about cartel and you're really just not wanting to be sold on this whole concept that the banking system's a cartel, think about it from this perspective. Cartels are companies that come together. On the surface, they look like competitors, right? This bank, that bank, we're all competing against each other. But they decide to join forces so they can improve their profits. What they do is they decide not to compete against each other, and they eliminate their competition. They fix the prices, they divide the product and geography. Like the Federal Reserve actually has 12 reserves in their system. The problem that cartels have is that it's hard to enforce the rules unless, of course, they make the agreements into a law, which is why they partner with the government, like back in 1913 when they got together. Well, in 1910 is when they sort of met for the first time before they actually created the law. But they got together to partner with the government. What is the Federal Act? Really, it's nothing more than the banking industry of 1913 getting the government to pass a law to take their fraternal cartel agreement and make it a law. So the cartel's fraternal agreement is now the law, that the letter of the law. I mean, they weren't, they weren't stupid. They set it up nicely. So the federal system has the appearance, or is kind of an illusion of government control, because the president appoints the board of directors. However, neither the president nor Congress has any control over what the Federal Reserve System does. Period. They're completely independent. There's an interview of a former board of directors from the Federal Reserve, and he states openly that nobody essentially in any of the U.S., anywhere in the U.S., can dictate what they can do. Congress awarded this amazing power to the Federal Reserve System, a power they themselves don't have, to create money, right? And creating the nation's money is a power the Congress doesn't have, but the Federal Reserve has, and the Federal Reserve is a private company. Does it make sense? So now private bankers basically have a monopoly, on the power to create the nation's money, backing it by nothing at all, not gold, not silver, nothing precious metal, no commodities, nothing, and they just create it out of thin air. Just poof, there's money. I mean, the theory, of course, and it was touched on in the video, the theory is that it's in the best interest of the American people, but the truth is, this is a cartel. And at the very core of a cartel, they do what is in their best interest, no one else's. And that was another daily eye-opener from the Eyes Open Network. I sure hope you got what you needed out of that video, and that you understand the Federal Reserve a little bit more. And the upcoming collapse is not something that we're just making up out of thin air. There's the very real evidence and very real information backing these claims of economic collapse. If you take the time to look into it and open your eyes, and you will see that there is some merit to all of these things that we're mentioning. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Let us know what you think. Post your comments below. We look forward to hearing from you. Take care, and we'll see you again on the next Eyes Open Network Daily Eye Opener.